Hi, we're gonna get so I just want to bring everyone back to the days before the 2020 election, just to think about, all the kind of crazy things we were seeing and processing. And I have to say, I was glued to the television, I was consuming too much media for my own mental health at that time. Just kind of amazed by what was happening and what was being said. And I just didn't even know how to process it all. And one of the faces that kept appearing on my screen was this face right here. And honestly, every time you came on, Secretary Benson, I was like, thank God for her. She is standing up for our rights as voters, as Americans, as citizens, in a way that I just was incredibly impressed by and thankful for, and just wish that we had such protection in the Secretary of State's office in all of our states, because so much is triggered off of what you do or don't do in that role. And so when we were kind of thinking about this conference, I was like, we have to have, Secretary Benson come, and I'm just so honored that you've come and that you're here to talk with us all today. As you know, Secretary Benson has done so much for protecting voter rights in Michigan. She's kind of improved access overall, helped, protect poll workers, instituted all sorts of changes to the programs, and to really facilitate access to the voting booth for so many, and resulting in the highest turnout elections in 2020 and 2022, I think, in Michigan's history, which is just incredible. But, all that's nice. But I have to say, I heard you also ran the Boston Marathon, 8 months pregnant, and is one of the few people ever to do that. And so, as if she wasn't, kind of a superhero enough, she was to kind of make us all more amazed by that. So, Secretary Benson, just thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here as a woman, as a lawyer, as the former dean of a law school, as someone who studied law and went to college in Boston and nearby at Wellesley. So really great to be here with all of you today. Thank you for being such incredible hosts as well. It's just been delightful to spend the day with you. And I'm confident that the things that you're hearing and what you've learned, I hope you'll take with you in this critical election moment that we're in for the history of our country and our democracy. And it's one that really connects back to, in my view, those who've come before us in historical and critical moments like this. And some of you know I started my career in Montgomery, Alabama, investigating hate groups and hate crimes with the Southern Poverty Law Center. And it was really there where I felt a sense of responsibility and spending time in Selma specifically, where I recognized the deep sacrifices that had occurred throughout our history, lives lost, and other great sacrifices made so that we could simply ensure that one person, one vote promise in our Constitution is a reality for everyone. And I felt a deep sense of responsibility and also inspiration to continue the work of the foot soldiers who worked and marched and bled in Selma in furtherance of that promise of our democracy. And I say this as the daughter of two special education teachers who taught me at a young age that everyone needs to have a seat at the table and equal access to opportunity in our country if our educational system and our economy are going to function and flourish. So for me, I believe that the best chance for equity, our greatest opportunity for ensuring everyone has access to equality of opportunity in our country begins and ends with access to the vote. And certainly those who oppose equality for all have figured that out as well throughout our history and have leveraged access to the vote in a way to further inequity, when in reality that promise in our Constitution of one person, one vote is the only real promise, tangible promise of equal power that we have. but it is perhaps all we need or should need in order to achieve equity everywhere else. And so in 2020, secretaries of state were in the spotlight as we worked to protect the will of the people against an unprecedented, nationally coordinated effort to undo the accurate results of a presidential election. And in Michigan, we were ready. I mean, we had worked with clerks to modernize voter registration systems to ensure every eligible citizen could register and vote. Even on election day itself, people could register and vote in 2020 and beyond. We educated all citizens in our state about their right to vote from home, which was critical in the midst of a pandemic. We sent absentee ballot request forms to every registered voter in the state, and we installed over 1,000 secure drop boxes for people to return those ballots in a safe and reliable way. We couldn't even assume that the post office would be functional in November. We had to do it all ourselves to make sure voters had a safe and secure election process. We also recognize that democracy is a team sport, and so we partnered with nonpartisan organizations, including all 4 of Detroit's major professional sports teams, to elevate the truth and ensure every voter had the confidence and the clarity that they needed to exercise their right to vote, even in the midst of a global pandemic. So when the polls closed in November of 2020, I was proud. We had administered a smooth, seamless, secure election in which more Michigan citizens had voted on both sides of the aisle than ever before in our state's history. And so we expected, and a lot of our conversations up to that point were about how do we replicate this? How do we celebrate this? How do we keep the momentum going? But then the momentum shifted. And in the weeks that followed, we began to see what unfolded, which was this unprecedented nationally coordinated effort to interfere with the tabulation of valid votes, to block the certification of election results, and to attempt to submit a false slate of electors to the National Archives. And we saw all of this escalate into the tragedy at our U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And through all of this, particularly on January 6th, it became abundantly clear that we were up against not just an effort to overturn the results of one legitimate and fair presidential election. We were actually in the midst of a battle over the future of democracy itself. And we noted, and we still know, that democracy prevailed in 2020. It prevailed because people of integrity on both sides of the aisle followed the law, upheld our constitutional principles, and ensured that every valid vote counted. And as a result, many of us engaged in that work faced threats to our safety and our lives simply for doing our work, our jobs, with integrity. And the Brennan Center, as Wendy mentioned earlier, has issued a number of reports that underscore not just the threats that we have endured in the months and years since that election, but how many also have left the profession of election administration since 2020, and how universal and prevalent threats, harassment, and abuse has become the norm in our profession, all because of lies. And it's remarkable that instead of celebrating the successes of our democracy expanding, the majority of citizens in our country fear that democracy has retracted, that voter suppression, or in some cases, and voter fraud and others, is on the rise, even though in reality, more people are voted than ever before in 2020. People continue to participate in our elections, but at the same time, the battle over misinformation feels like it's winning because you see more and more people losing faith in their voice and in their vote in our democracy. And what I'm worried about as we enter into now this election cycle is this lies and these misinformation that have become the norm will lead to even more threats, and very real threats, about our elections and targeting election officials. A lot of you might know the incident that happened outside of my home shortly after the 2020 presidential election. It was about 9 o'clock on a Saturday night, and I was hanging up ornaments with my then 4-year-old at our Christmas tree in our home, and How the Grinch Stole Christmas was on in the background. And then all of a sudden, a dozen armed individuals showed up on my doorstep. And over the course of an hour, they grew in numbers, and they stood outside my home chanting, "Stop the steal," calling me a murderer, waking our neighbors, shouting obscenities and graphic threats into these bullhorns, and filming it all on Facebook Live, which notably became a source of footage to be showed at the congressional hearings because, of course, this was a scene that would repeat in greater magnitude and escalate towards violent ends 1 month later at our United States Capitol. Yet in that moment, we had men and women outside demanding that I come outside and show myself, face them about the results of the 2020 presidential election, results that the votes and the will of the people had made abundantly clear. But at that time, and even still today, you had a number of people who had been lied to, who had been fooled by candidates that they trusted, by then a sitting president, and they were more adept to believe that lie than the truth that was right in front of them. And so as things unfolded that evening, I was, taking care of my son, running loud bathwater to drown out all the noise that he could sense the calmness inside our home. I was also aware that in that moment, only one unarmed neighborhood security guard on my front porch stood between us and the growing crowd. I didn't know if things were going to escalate. I didn't know if people were going to enter our home. I didn't know if there was going to be a gunshot or a stray bullet entering our home. I didn't know when law enforcement was going to arrive. We were on the phone with them and they weren't showing up, and we didn't know what was going to happen when they did. And amidst all of this, I'm thinking, is this what it means to serve on the front lines, defending democracy, actively protecting my family against these threats of violence at our doorstep, while also trying to protect the results of a legitimate presidential election? It was harrowing, and the uncertainty of that moment was really one that stays with me to this day. But also in that moment, I thought of John Lewis and others who stood on the front lines of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965. And they chose to march forward because they knew the attacks that the Alabama state troopers at the time, armed with billy clubs and tear gas, were threatening them with, were not really targeting them as individuals. They were targeting our democracy writ large and the promise that democracy be fulfilled for every citizen in our country. So as all those threats and hateful words are being shouted outside my home, I knew that also they weren't aimed at me. They weren't aimed at my family. They were aimed at the voters of our state. They were aimed at our democracy. And they were aimed at every person throughout history who had stood on the front lines to defend it. And when I realized that in that moment, I couldn't control all the folks outside my home, all the angry individuals who had been lied to, who were threatening me and my family. I couldn't stem the throw of misinformation into our democracy or deter the countless politicians, including a former president and the sitting president at the time, who chose to deceive their supporters about the results of a safe and secure election just to further their own agendas or cope with a loss. That was out of my control. But I could control not allowing the fear or the threats to deter me or anyone else from protecting our elections and defending every voice and every vote. Because we knew those threats, and I know those threats, aren't against us. They're threats to democracy. They're threats to the promise of power for every citizen in our country. And the answer to the threats is to respond knowing that the truth, law, justice, history, and the American people, the vast majority of American people, are on the side of democracy and are on the side of that truth. And what I learned in that moment and also throughout 2020 was that the future of our democracy is going to be determined by whether we, in this moment, do all we can to recognize these very real and ongoing threats to the system, and that the way that they're manifesting as real and ongoing threats to election officials, and that these are threats to the entire fabric of who we are as Americans. They're threats to everything we fight for and everything this country is founded on. And so we can respond those threats by choosing in this moment to stand undeterred at the foot of a metaphorical Edmund Pettus Bridge today and every day, choosing to continue on, keep going in service of who we are, the rights we stand for, and the democracy we seek to protect. It's a democracy where every vote counts and where every voice is heard. It's one where our kids can go to school free from fear of gun violence and where unarmed men and women of color are not terrorized or killed during a traffic stop. It's one where our democracy thrives and our justice prevails. And that's the world we're fighting for. That's what our democracy is designed to enable. And that's the world and the promise that we all must fight for together. And it all starts with all of us choosing to do our part to stand and fight for our democracy, just as those who've come before us and those who are doing now continue to do. And so my ask here for you today is that you join that fight and that you think about your role in that work, both as women, as lawyers, and as citizens in a democracy that is under threat, but that has a path forward, as it always has. And that path and that solution is found in all of us. And it's found in the citizens of this country, who, the vast majority of who, believe in that promise and believe in our role in protecting it. So thanks, and happy to take some questions. of time, about 15 minutes. I can take some questions.
So first, my cousin works for David John. She just moved to Michigan. She wanted me to tell you that you're a badass. So I want to make sure you know that. But the other thing is, how have you proactively worked to continue people engaging around coalition work, being co-workers, like providing the stability, safety that people may need to engage?
I think in two ways. One, we've been actively, that's our ask all around the state. You want to, whether you believe in our democracy or not, come work to see how it actually works and be a part of ensuring everyone else can vote. So getting people to sign up, we actually launched a statewide program called Democracy MVP, noting that in a democracy, the most valuable players are our election workers. And we've recruited 80,000 folks since March of 2020, which was when we launched it. 50,000 in 2020 and 21, and then 30,000 in 2022 and 2023. So 80,000 total, and we've been working to then train those folks in the work and prepare them to do the work of protecting democracy, and then have passed laws to ensure it's a crime to threaten these folks and provide support for them so that they feel safe and protected. But what's been really inspiring, and is not often told in these numbers about people leaving the profession, is how many people have joined the profession determined to stand up and make sure democracy works. And I've visited polling places and have done election protection work for 20 years, since the 2000 election, really, so almost close to a quarter of a century. And when we go and visit precincts, oftentimes it's a little sleepy. People are just like, going around their way, and sometimes there's lines, but there's never, there's sort of almost a malaise around it. When I went and showed up in 2022 to some precincts in Detroit, like walking into it, I was met with this boost of energy, of like strength and determination from these poll workers who've been working elections for 20, 30, 40 years. And they're like, not on our watch. Is anyone going to come by and check? We're here. And my son is now signed up, and he's going to be an election worker. And it's like the other side of all of this that we've seen in Michigan is that we have more laws protecting access to the vote than ever before because voters voted for them in 2022 and in 2018. We have more people signing up to be election workers than ever before. And we have, more people voting than ever before. We led the nation in youth vote turnout. So there's another side to these challenges, which is also, in Michigan, our democracy is getting stronger. And we've got a lot more work to do, but my hope is that this moment can be a pathway to creating a stronger and healthier and more robust democracy than ever before, because that's also what we really need in this moment. We're in a moment in the history of our country where we have the opportunity to successfully become a true multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural democracy, where equal governance and collaborative governance rules the day. And there's never really been a country, a democracy that's been able to do that successfully, but we can. And that's the fight, to me, to be a part of. That's the exciting part to fight for in this moment. And I think that's what we'll ultimately transition to when this particular moment ceases. The threats this particular moment ceases.
Juliet talked a little bit this morning about getting prepared for what happens after the election. And has Michigan no matter who wins, so has Michigan been actually planning for post-election type of activities? Okay. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, when we prepare for any election, we build out the infrastructure to make sure we have enough paper for the ballots and enough people to man the polls and all of that. And then our second pillar is voter education, which is making sure citizens know about their opportunities to vote. The third is election security, which has in recent years been about protecting our citizens against election misinformation, which is really the biggest threat to election security, including artificial intelligence, which is new this year, of course. And then now the fourth pillar is our post-election plans, from scenario planning, where we'll work with law enforcement and clerks to plan out what an interference with the polls could look like and how to respond to that, to ensuring our first responders and our police officers are ready to step in if necessary, if things escalate, to having a very strong cadre of lawyers prepared with even sample briefs to respond to, no worries, to respond to legal filings, which we know will escalate, and then of course just all the noise. Having lived through one of the most challenging post-election ground zeros in any state in 2020, we all are know what we're up against this year as well. So we've got that experience as well under our belts. But yeah, it's now a part of election planning and preparation for all of us to have a post-election plan as well.
Yes.
So I'm going to lean into the political side a little bit with this question, but kind of building off Sunu's question about poll workers and sort of, living here in Massachusetts, we touched on this earlier. Oftentimes during a presidential year, we have to find other states to be active in because, we have a pretty solid baseline here. And I'm just wondering, as you learn from your colleagues and other secretaries of state, are there particular states that, because of all the things you've talked about, the things that you've done in Michigan to kind of build up that infrastructure protection, that would benefit from sort of us mobilizing some of the legal resources in those states? And, are there ones that you could highlight? I mean, what I'm really dying to ask you is, what you think of our own Secretary of State, who may have been Secretary of State since you were at Wellesley, if I'm doing my math right.
Secretary of
But
State.
I will not expect you to talk about the Prince of Darkness in his own state.
I mean, I will say after Bill's challenge, the primary challenge in his most recent reelection, we've seen him showing up a lot more and being more of a part of things than ever before. So that's great. And when I first ran for this office in 2010 and I had a fundraiser here, he came to it. So he's been active. I think what I've observed is the primary challenge he survived in 22, I think it was, has really, there you go, has propelled him to be much more active than ever before, at the national level at least. There are 6 states that are going to see the brunt of the challenges this year: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. Of those 6 states, only 2, Michigan and Georgia, have secretaries of state who were there in 2020. Everyone else is new. Pennsylvania has a secretary of state, Al Schmidt, and a governor, Josh Shapiro, who were there in 2020, but in different roles. And so they're not as inexperienced, but you'd also have folks for whom in Nevada and Arizona, in Arizona, you have a Secretary of State who's a former clerk, and you have a very experienced clerk in Maricopa County, which is the vast majority of voters in the state, who is already, his name's Stephen Richer, doing above and beyond what is needed. And then you've got Katie Hobbs as governor, who was secretary in 2020. So all that to say is, Nevada, from an infrastructure standpoint, I'm most concerned about Nevada and Wisconsin, because there's been a lot of turnover there. But Michigan is the purplest of the purple states, to the extent that all of those 6 are considered purple states. And so the weaponry, the battle will come to our state, and it already has. I mean, Trump was there yesterday. Biden's there next week. So it's all the noise is going to really focus on voters in our state in a very significant way. So all that to say is, if you're thinking about where to go, you look at those 6 states. You've also got New Hampshire and North Carolina on the East Coast to think about as well, where support could be helpful. You can make calls, or you can volunteer to be part of an election protection effort in one of those states. Whereas lawyers, you're helping other lawyers to be mindful and watchful on election day, and also educating people about the vote. So also look for organizations that are focusing on those states if you want to be financially supportive. But all those things, I think the battlefields will be those states this year.
I was wondering if you could speak a little about sort of moderate, like bringing people together across partisan lines. I think democracy feels like a topic that should be a place where we could really find some common ground. And I feel like that's one of the scariest things to me now, is just how divided and extreme both sides feel in some ways. And like, I really feel like success is often found somewhere in the middle and through compromise. And so I imagine that probably is something that comes up in your work in a state like Michigan. And I would be curious to hear either just your perspective generally, or real strategies that you use to try to bring people to the table who might be, on opposite sides of issues.
Yeah, from a democracy standpoint, or even writ large, I think data, and my academic background as someone who just likes to research and find solutions, there's really very little partisanship. There can be, there's certainly different ways in which solutions can have partisan bents. But for many things, just looking at the data and, in voting, for example, it's very clear if you have a goal of increasing turnout among all, there's data points like election day registration, or enabling people to vote from home that have been shown to increase participation on folks of on both sides of the aisle. And in the battleground states as well, we've been very intentional about recruiting and building a team that is bipartisan. The the Maricopa County clerk, Steve Richer, is a Republican. The Secretary of State of Pennsylvania is a Republican, appointed by a Democrat. You've got myself, and then Brad Raffensperger is sort of like the veterans who were there in 20 coming back. And then a Democrat in charge of elections in Nevada, and in Wisconsin it's appointed, and it's an appointed independent position. Megan Wolf, who's been there for a long time as an administrator and may not be there in the fall, we're not sure, but appointed by a Republican legislature. So you've got a number of different voices at the table. What's been very challenging is that you also have a lot of politicians at the table who, on both sides, will use politics to eclipse, oftentimes, good solutions or just common sense. And that can be really discouraging. And probably one of the most discouraging things I found in seeking to build partnerships across the aisle is just how many people allow egos and also partisanship to supersede the work. I refer to it as people choose to be politicians instead of professionals. But election officials have the greatest opportunity to just be professionals, and so I've enjoyed finding bipartisan cooperation among professional election workers. But we're seeing far too many secretaries of state now choose to be politicians instead, and that's really disheartening because if anyone should be above the fray, it's those who are overseeing our elections. Yeah.
I have a question about, Massachusetts, we assume is, voting Democrat, at least at the presidential level, and we all feel somewhat, I think, comfortable with that. I know a lot of Trump voters in Massachusetts, and I think a lot of people don't. Maybe we all do. Do you see any vulnerabilities in Massachusetts election laws that could ever make things, we have so many problems here in Massachusetts. I mean, like economic, racial disparities, housing. I mean, do we have, issues that will make us change because of the, discontent that people have here?
Yeah, there's structural changes like election day registration, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, automatic voter registration of everyone when they get a driver's license, allowing people, I don't think you even have early voting here, from what I understand. Do you have no reason absentee voting?
Yes.
Okay, so you have the voting procedures, and you have a permanent absentee list, so you just sign up and you always get your ballot mailed to you? So that would be the additional piece there. So you're kind of maybe at 60%. But it sounds like voter registration needs to be modernized. I think you allow online voter registration.
Oh.
But okay. So for example, in Michigan, you can register to vote online, and then you can request a ballot to be mailed to your home. And so one of the things that enables us to do this year are go to college campuses, and we're going to have a competition between Michigan and Michigan State with their own QR code to say, use this QR code. You have from September to October 15th to register to vote or check your registration and make sure you're registered, and then request your ballot to be mailed to your dorm. And then once they get it, they can return it through the mail or at a drop box or at an early voting center. That's how we get people voting. And so we can do that all with a QR code. And that's the type of stuff that really starts to move the needle, particularly around folks who might not be reached by other reforms.
We do have online registration to vote.
Got it.
Fact checker.
I'm not sure if you can answer this, but earlier during the panel, Wendy had talked about how voter suppression efforts are actually working to suppress the votes with specifically African American voters. But then I always see, the readout after every election. It's like, if African American voters had voted in this level, then it's almost like suppression of the vote, but then also you're expected to save the election every single time. And then I sort of see that there's a lot of pressure. And I see that happening again now, sort of the narrative in Michigan with, the numbers of uncommitted voters. And then people are kind of saying like, oh my gosh, all these uncommitted voters who are trying to make a very specific statement around, U.S. Foreign policy and our, I'm just wondering, and I just don't know if you can actually answer because I feel like it was veering into the political as well. What are ways we can let people know about, the voter suppression efforts and the ways in which it's harder for some communities to vote and turn out to vote than others? I'm thinking specifically in Florida when people were being arrested when they tried to go vote.
It's intentional and strategic, yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I think one, there's a reason why within those battleground states, the place where people showed up to try to stop the counting of votes in 2020 were Detroit, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Milwaukee, and Phoenix, right? Like that's clearly a stretch. The places the former president called to try to stop the certification was in Detroit and Wayne County, and similarly in other states. Should not surprise any of us that this continues to be a strategy, especially because of the power of the Black vote and the power of the youth vote and the power of voters of color to actually, especially with changing demographics, determine the outcome of any election in which they choose to show up in full force. So one of the realities, and what I'm trying to communicate to voters in Michigan, is the power, that you actually do have the power to determine the election. And that's why so many people are targeting Black voters and women of color and young voters. I didn't say so many people, but that's why people who can't win, people who can only win if you stay home, are going to try to, that's their political strategy, to get you to stay home. And so I think it's important to see that, but not allow that to diminish or confuse the reality, which is that, yeah, you do have the power to decide and thereby save the election. I mean, you look at Shea and Ruby in Georgia, like they not only were a part of an infrastructure in Georgia to help ensure valid votes were counted, then they took the attacks, they took the, and yet they didn't allow that to deter them, and instead they fought back and won a $185 million, verdict, right? And so it's to me, it is a tragic and beautiful thing that time and time again, voters of color are asked to save our democracy. It's the quote, like the quote from Martin Luther King when, I think it was after 1964 or 65, and where he said, I fear we have just inherited, I think it was after 65, I fear we have inherited a burning building, and so we must all become firefighters. And so it is a tragic and beautiful responsibility and opportunity, but the power is real. It was one example in Michigan. My obsession over the next 6 months is going to be around these numbers. There are just close to 2 million voters in Michigan. I can't remember if I mentioned this earlier. 2 million, 1.85 million voters in Michigan between the ages of 18 and 29. And that's in a state where the highest turnout in 2020 was 5.5 million. So you've got close to 2 million eligible voters, all of whom are 18 and 19, most of whom, vast majority of whom are voters of color, the majority of whom are not in college, and the majority of whom are not voting. In fact, of that group of close to 2 million voters, 800,000 voted in 2020, the high watermark, highest turnout we ever had. And that's more than ever before. We led the nation in youth vote turnout. But that's 1 million eligible young people not voting. Most of them are registered. In fact, all but 300,000 are registered, but they're not voting. And so, yet if they did, ball game, that's the ball game. It's 1 million people in a state that was decided by 150,000 votes and thereby decided the presidency. These young people can by solely voting, choose the next president of the United States. And so that's what we're trying to say to them. Not, all these other stuffs and, yes, but the power. I do mock elections 3 times a week in different high schools around the state of Michigan. And all I say is, we're going to walk through an election. Just know your power. Know that you may be sitting here feeling like I'm 18 years old. This world isn't for me. I don't have a place here. When exactly the opposite is true. That if you all got together and got more people together and reached out to everyone who looks like you and is at your age, you guys elect the next president of the United States by your actions. So there's a lot more work around that, and I'm still trying to dig in to figure out what we need to do over the next 6 months to communicate to those 1 million young people the power they have to change and define this country, their country, for the future. But yeah, they do have that opportunity and responsibility and burden. But it's one that's a beautiful burden of having power in a democracy.
Are you on TikTok?
I was just gonna
I am not on TikTok, and I tried once, years ago in 2020, and I was like, ugh. I don't care. I'm not on. I do Instagram, but I can't. It's just I feel morally opposed to it, and then they got the whole China thing and all that stuff. But I'm on Instagram.
I like the sports teams ideas too.
Yeah, we partner with all the sports teams and a number of different other things. a lot of it is just there's all the research and data and organization. It's all there. We just have to figure out how to harness it to move the needle, and that's what I'm trying to do. I think I have time for one more question.
One more question.
Yes.
Thank you so much for literally. And I felt the same way. You were like the bright light on so much of the terrible news we were watching for years. I'm thinking about you a little bit and your trajectory, and I was thinking, my God, you're at this ground zero, as you say, in our democracy moving forward. Oh my God, the burden. But then I read your background and I think you kind of have built your career to get to this point. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. How strategic were you to move through your career to get to this point? And I know no one plans it and it's perfect flow, but just thinking about you in this moment and what you bring to the table and how that.
Well, as I mentioned, I started my career in Selma. And it was really just there where I said a prayer to be used. I was right out of college. I said, I just want to be used however I could, wherever I am, to continue this battle. That's it. And so I feel really honored that I get to do that. But it's not even been strategic. It's just been by not giving up, by having that as my North Star, doing that work wherever I was, whether I'm a dean of a law school or a professor, just always finding ways to do the work and allowing that to guide my decisions as opposed to seeking any particular position. That said, it became clear to me shortly after the 2000 election that secretaries of state have a very underappreciated and powerful role in protecting every voice and every vote. So it was really after the 2000 election where Catherine Harris in Florida showed how these offices could be used to diminish the accuracy of a vote count or block a full recount from coming to fruition as she did. That I started to study and focus on how to push and compel secretaries of state to do the right thing. And I was really moved by the fact that we as voters choose our secretaries of state. And yet we don't really pay attention to who we're choosing. They're not high profile races. So I wrote a book on the office in 2008 to communicate to voters, like, these are these offices. They control every other vote that you cast. And I told the stories of every sitting secretary of state at the time, including Bill Gardner, who was New Hampshire's Secretary of State for like 70 years. I think since 1971, I think he was when he was appointed. And they're all different stories. It's called Secretaries of State Guardians in the Democratic Process. It was after writing that book and the last interview I did with Jennifer Brunner, who was the Secretary of State in Ohio at the time, that I was like, this is the job I want to do. This is where you can do more than any other one position to actually impact and move the needle on protecting every voice and every vote. So then I was like, okay, how do I become secretary? I got to run for office. Okay. So then you learn how to run for office. But it's all is to move to this goal. And then I lost my first election. But I also knew intrinsically there was a reason. I knew at the time that timing mattered. And so it's an open seat every 8 years. We have term limits. I've made plans to just run 8 years later. And it was funny because I did really well in the 2010 election. I outperformed the Democratic candidate for governor by like 12 points, and I almost won in a very bad year for Democrats. And so for 8 years, I kept running, basically. I was the dean of a law school, but I never stopped doing the work. And by the time we got to 2018, the Democrats and the Republicans in Michigan were like, just let her have it. No one challenged me. I barely had a Republican opponent, and I'm too tired of I can't. And so, and again, I outperformed the ticket and did it again in 22, which was also gratifying because it shows if you just talk to voters and say, I want to do this job and I want to do it well for everyone, they respond. And if you can elevate running for office and take it away from partisanship and just take it about actually sincerely with data, proposing solutions and having a plan to implement them, voters respond, and across party lines you can build that support. So, thanks.
Incredible work she's doing. I can't wait to see what she does next. I want to know what her next time in a marathon is with a baby. And I will say this, Novi is still taping, or is this I have a book coming out a year from now. It's called Purposeful Warrior, which is also, there's a lot more stories in there like the one I shared today about how we all can be warriors on behalf of ourselves and our communities. And if we all do that, we can change the world.
March on Selma recently again. She got to see to the city. I mean, just incredible. What a day we've had. We're so grateful you could make time for us. I know you're all over speaking. Yes, and doing all of that. So thank you so much. Next up, our conference chairs are going to close out the day for you and kind of bring our minds and hearts together one more time.
I think I said we're gonna start in opposite order.
I just want to say, like, wow, that, if I do say so myself, that was amazing. I feel so inspired by all of the discussion today, and each of you who spoke and inspired us and sang and read poetry, like, my goodness, such an impressive group of women. And I think the purpose of this, when we kind of selected this topic and thought about who the speakers were, knowing that in a few months we're going to be completely preoccupied by the election, like, this is purposeful. We've got several months to kind of engage with our communities, figure out how we can be impactful in this election. We got a lot of great ideas today on how to do that, and I hope each and every one of you tells 10 friends and engages them in this important fight for our democracy, but also just, like, lovely to see you all and reconnect with the school and with all of you. So just thank you for coming.
Okay, I took notes. So I'm going to give a list of some of the lessons that I picked up on today. So the first one was the power of community. The second one was don't abdicate your power. The third one was cherry blossoms, mice, and generational trauma. Another one was, lean into your lane, educate yourself and others. I fear we have all inherited a burning building, and so we must all become firefighters. And then purposeful warrior. And so I thought it was important to just weave all of that together to talk again about how this room fosters community. So many people I saw last year are here again, and every year it seems it just builds and builds. Thanks to Miel's leadership and Julianne, who really has done a great job in it's the first one, right? But also all of you, what you bring into the room and how that feeds into how great every single panel, every single discussion, every single speaker, it just makes it rich and just adds to this very rich tapestry. And so I think thank you to everyone in this room, but especially my co-chairs. Northeastern University School of Law, which is just an amazing place. And I think there's spirit and there's just this amazing spirit in the walls that continues. And may we all be purposeful warriors.
Thanks, Umi and Geri. I don't know what I can say to top what you both said. I would add one more thing. I loved your list, and I would add what Sunu said, which really struck me, which is we are together. Like, I think that is so powerful to remember, even when you're in the grip of the anger, pain, whatever you're feeling because someone you love or you can't understand where they're coming from, how they could have the opinion they have. I feel like that we are together is so powerful. And if we can hold on to that, and I thank you, Sunu, for that. That was beautiful. So I can't stand up here without crying, apparently. So anyway, thank you for all coming together here today. Like Umi said, this is, the power is in all of us here and what we bring to it and what we take away and how we impact, how we make an impact from here in all that we do, in all of our spaces. So thank you all so much, and thank everyone for making this
My deepest gratitude to the three of you. What a great day. Thanks everyone for coming. I hope you join us downstairs for drinks. Thanks for making this a part of your Friday and a part of your week, and support women in the law. So thank you.